Welcome to the Jewish Diasporist, a podcast exploring the political, social, and cultural implications of life in diaspora. I am one of your hosts, Jordan Yanowitz.
And this is Gabe from the Jawn podcast. We're smashing into the Jewish Diasporist and joining Jordan for this episode. Jawn is a labor history podcast focusing on Philadelphia and the surrounding world. It's LABORJAWN if you're not from Philly and don't know what Jawn is.
That's right. This is a crossover episode.
It's the greatest crossover since Dubinsky and Hillman.
That's a little niche, but if you know, then this is certainly the episode for you.
And in this collaborative interview, we interview Professor Caroline Luce, a scholar of Jewish labor history in the United States.
With Dr. Luce, we discuss the complex history of Jews in America, sketching a portrait that weaves together the role of immigration and Jewish institutions, including labor unions, synagogues, mutual aid societies, and colonial ventures, within the wider landscape of colonialism and capitalism here in the United States.
And by connecting Jewish labor history with the migration of American Jews west from the East Coast, specifically New York and Philadelphia, all the way to the West Coast in Los Angeles, we explore the shifting landscape of Jewish American labor history and its impact today.
If you value this sort of media, consider supporting these podcasts. You can find the Jewish Diasporist on Patreon, and every little bit helps. You can also find us on Instagram at the Jewish Diasporist Pod to stay up to date and hear about our latest adventures.
And you can find Jawn across all major podcast platforms, on Instagram at Jawn and at laborjawn.com and on Patreon.
With all that out of the way, we hope you enjoy this exciting interview with Dr. Caroline Luce.
Brüder und Schwester von Arbeit und Neut, alle, was seinen zerseht und zerspreit, zusammen, die von sie ist gerät, sie flattert von Zorn, von Blut ist sie reut, a Schwur, auf Leben und Tod.
Caroline, Gabe, it's wonderful sitting down with you both. This is a collaboration, an interview featuring both the Jewish Diasporist podcast and Gabe Christie from the Jawn podcast. It's really wonderful to dig into the history of Jewish labor organizing here in the United States. Caroline, would you like to just introduce yourself, talk a little bit about who you are, your relationship to union organizing, and to your studies?
Yeah, sure. My name is Caroline Luce. I am a project director at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment and the communications chair of UCAFT, which represents lecturers and librarians at the University of California. My background is in history. I studied here at UCLA from 2006 to 2013. And my interest is in immigration, working class culture, and in the American West, past and present, I guess, is what I would say to that.
Wonderful. So on the Jewish Diasporist podcast, we've mainly been interviewing Jews, people who practice Judaism or otherwise ethnically Jewish. But you're not Jewish. What brought you to study Jewish labor history in particular?
I studied history of religion in college, and I became particularly interested in the kind of space between religion and social movements, the way that faith communities got involved in work in the real world, if you will, and vice versa, and the kind of dynamic tensions and affinities between those kind of two orbits of activity. And I came to UCLA thinking I was going to study sort of itinerant preachers in the mining communities of Northern California, which is where I'm from, but I needed a job and I got recruited to process the papers of the Western States Jewish History Association. The organizational name sounds a lot more formal than it was. This was basically an optometrist and a rabbi who were kind of history buffs who were long before the internet, going around to communities throughout California, often sort of reading Metsevas, headstones, and just finding Jewish sounding names and doing this kind of first wave exhumation of Jewish history in the American West. And in their collection, in between boxes on famous rabbis and famous rich guys and famous Jewish institutions, there was a folder on bagels. I said to myself, what the hell is this doing here? I'm born and raised in San Francisco. At that time, there was a paucity of deli culture and bagels broadly. So I started poking around in the history of the bagel, and it turns out there was a bagel bakers union in New York. And so I wrote my first paper in graduate school, basically arguing that when you say New York style bagel, what you really mean is union style bagel, because through craft regulation in a variety of ways, controlled the size and the shape and the production technique involved in making bagels. But I was in LA. I didn't want to write about New York. Found that there was a branch of the same baking union, although not exclusive to bagel bakers, here in Los Angeles. And to exhume their history, I had to learn Yiddish and kind of map the landscape of labor and left-wing community organizing here in Los Angeles. And so the book that this is all going into is called Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, Jewish Radicalism, Labor and Culture in Los Angeles. And I'm happy to say, after many, many years of research, it should be coming out next year. It's under contract with NYU Press. So
Exciting.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I have to love the leaning into stereotypes of that historical society being an optometrist and rabbi with a folder on bagels.
It had this amazing cover of Miami Magazine. What really drew me in, it's a cover of Miami Magazine from the 1970s that had this red, white, and blue bagel. And above it said the Americanization of the bagel. And I was like, that's it. That's it. That's a grad student paper right there.
So leaning into the labor side of everything, does a study of Jews across America or in Western America, or in the American West rather, add to your understanding of labor history more broadly?
I think there's a few ways to answer that question. On the one hand, I think that Jews provide an interesting case study. Immigrants have always been out front of the American labor movement. I would argue that the history of the American labor movement is a history of immigration to this country. And I am very interested in my contemporary work in the kind of overlaps and connections in terms of the strategies deployed to organize within diasporic communities generally. So on the one hand, Jews presented a case study of a lot of the themes and questions I was interested in that I referenced before. But on the other hand, as with many things in Jewish history, there's this kind of, the universal versus the particular, right? So in some ways, there is a universal story that the story of Jewish workers allows one to tell that I'm interested in. But there's particular patterns and forms of organizing, particular strategies and techniques, particular industries that are different. And I will say Jewish labor history is not one necessarily of heavy industry. Miners, steel workers, Jews didn't achieve the same kind of density in those communities. They were often not recruited purposefully and intentionally because of their reputation for being radicals and anti-Semitism into some of those more far-flung mining towns, steel towns, mill towns. So there is a particular in the sense that it's usually goods produced for the consumer market rather than sort of heavy machinery, heavy equipment, heavy industrial labor. So there's elements of the story of the American labor movement that are left out when your focus is on Jews. But to me, there are also themes and strategies and tactics and developments that I think are really, really important. And that's borne out by the fact that I've been teaching a class here at UCLA on the history of garment workers, past, present, and future for years now. And I don't know if my students who enroll in that class realize that they're going to basically get American Jewish labor history as part of that class. The class is called A Common Thread. I think it is a common thread and one that is an interesting lens to the whole story.
Definitely. And one thing I kind of uncovered studying specifically Jewish labor movement in Philly was the particularities of not just the Jewish labor movement, but how that movement in Philly tried to differentiate itself from New York, because obviously anything Jewish related in the US, it's either in the sphere of New York or desperately trying to remain independent from that hegemony. Have there been any particularities of the history of Jewish labor organizing on the West Coast versus what you would see on the East?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because it's kind of central to my work. In the book proposal, I talk about this thing called Western expectations, which is to say that the imagination of the West and its potential and all of its romance is a huge part of the formation of the region. So 2 ways to answer that question. One is to be a good materialist, to talk about what the work actually was in the West, right? And the narrative of labor in the West is so deeply intertwined with colonization and settlements and the labor demands of colonization. So in Los Angeles, we talk a lot about what we call the 2-tiered labor system, because as the mill towns of Western Pennsylvania are sort of going through this proletarianization process, at that very moment, the proletarianization process in the West is bifurcated by colonization and the demands of colonization. You needed bodies to fell trees, to clear land, to dig trenches, to lay track. The majority of that work from before the coming of the American state, I mean, really, when it was Mexican California, when it was Spanish California, that work has always been done by Brown and Black folk. And that created a sort of pool of mostly disenfranchised migratory workers that are coming in and out of cities in between gigs in sort of more far-flung communities. Some of those were white European immigrants, I will say. It was not exclusively Black and brown folks. But there's a degree to which, at least in California, our entire democratic structure was built around separating that workforce and making for a kind of Black and brown underclass, Black, brown, and Asian, I should say. A foreign miners tax, for example, passed in 1850s. They did not want immigrant workers, specifically Chinese workers, but immigrant workers broadly, to benefit from the gold rush. And so they passed a tax that they had to register and pay a fee to even have access to the fields. White European workers flipped their shit about that. They're like, what the hell, man? That's not right. So they amended the tax to be anyone who was eligible for citizenship down the road, but maybe wasn't a citizen yet, thereby directly drawing a racial fault line through the mining fields, right? Because at that time, folks of Asian descent could not become American citizens. So that bifurcated workforce means that the kind of pattern of working class formation is different in the American West. And that's been something that has sort of colored regional labor history for years. And I know that race and colonization shapes other regions in the US. I don't mean to say this is exclusive, but the timing matters, right? The timing of when these processes are unfolding. And that timing thing also has an analog within Jewish migration and the pattern of settlement in the West. The folks that I write about, most of them came west after having already been in the United States 5 or 10 years was the average, according to studies. Acculturated in certain ways. Many of them had developed some fluency in English. Many of them had saved up a certain amount of capital. I mean, you needed capital just to get on the train, but you also often brought with you some resources, both social and cultural as well as financial. And so the timing of arrival also matters. One of the things that's emerged in history of the American West in terms of Jewish studies in recent years has really been a much more critical engagement with Jews' relationship to colonization. My colleague Sherry Rabin has written a seminal text in this regard, which essentially argues that the reason Jews are afforded access to citizenship and access to inclusion, taking this sort of American exceptionalist theme in Jewish studies, which is to say it creates unprecedented opportunity for Jews, unlike anywhere in the world, and that's why it's the promised land. She kind of flips that on its head and says, well, the reason that's the case is because the expansion of market capitalism really relied on commercial mercantile networks that Jews have been plugged into in essentially every community across the world where they lived, right? So there's a time in San Francisco, for example, where something like 90% of the goods coming through the port of San Francisco are being distributed into commercial networks by Jewish importer-exporters. And Sherry has really helped us to see that access to inclusion that really results from the instrumental role that Jews played in the expansion of capitalism into the West, market capitalism specifically. So Hasia Diner has now followed this with another book that's about Jewish peddlers. We think of peddlers as being like a guy with a bindle, but think of it as more as a traveling salesman, which is to say goods are manufactured in the commercial port cities of the East and taken west on the backs or in the cars of Jewish peddlers. That is, again, another role that they had already been playing in Europe and is sort of recreated here in the United States. And I think more critical works in recent years, including my friend Maxwell Greenberg, David Kaufman, have really started to engage in the ways that Jews profited from colonialism in some of its most bare forms. David has written interesting work about the trade in kind of Indian curio products, right? The kind of roadside stand that's selling stuff, kitschy Indian product, and the ways that relationship, because it wasn't one of necessarily participating in genocide, but it was sort of being implicated in those processes. Mm-hmm. And here in LA, because of the timing of arrival, Jews were able to pick up hundreds of thousands of acres of land. The story I always tell is Harris Newmark has this anecdote in his book, 60 Years in California. There's a terrible drought in the 1860s that basically breaks the back of the Mexican land grant system. And so all these rancho owners are having kind of fire sales where they're selling off their land. And they're all happening on the steps of City Hall. And Harris Newmark tells this story of like walking by one day and the auctioneer is saying, $650 an acre, and he goes $725 or something like that, and he goes sold, and that tract that he bought became Wilshire Boulevard. He sold it like 10 years later at a profit of $15,000, which is some absurd amount of money today, just because he was joking around with his buddy and like took a dare and bet on it. So in Los Angeles in particular, but across the West broadly, I mean, Jews are serving in public service roles. The first sheriff of Orange County is Jewish. There's a Jewish mayor in LA. Herman Silver, for whom Silver Lake is named, was the first water commissioner. Vital kind of roles that my colleague Karen Wilson calls them urban pioneers. Now, I write about a different generation of Jews showing up much later, but they too are benefiting from the access to inclusion that sort of pioneer, quote unquote, generation served. And so their pattern of settlement is different. These are not the huddled masses arriving in the port and sort of huddled through the streets. These are folks, in some cases, who were sent by philanthropies on the East Coast. So the Industrial Removal Office, I believe it's Baron von Hirsch, who's the major philanthropist there. The Industrial Removal Office has this logic that, the real problem of Jewish immigration is just that they're crowded in eastern cities. And if we can resettle Jews out in farther flung communities, they'll have a better time. And so they sent something like 2,200 Jewish families to Los Angeles. Some of them they sent back because they were like, you can't work, we don't want you here. But that's a particular pattern of settlement. A lot of them were health seekers. Something like 25% of the migrants to LA in the late 19th century came suffering from chronic disease, whether that be asthma, rheumatism, or more serious conditions like tuberculosis. So one of my first exhibits for Mapping Jewish LA was about Jewish public health responses to tuberculosis. In both cases, what you see is that the imagination of the West as this virgin territory, as this site of regeneration, as this site of infinite possibility for both personal and communal development, mobility, and growth is animating the settlement there. It's drawing people here. And what I'm interested in my work is how those expectations, both that Jews themselves held of who they were and where they sat in the social and racial landscape of the West, and expectations about Jews, how people imagined their place in that same social landscape, inform their experiences. And I say that in particular because the neighborhood, anyone who spent time in LA can tell you this is a land of ubiquitous single-family homes, right? There is a downtown, yes, and people live in loft apartment buildings downtown, but most of us, whether we be someone who works at a poultry factory in Huntington Gardens or someone who works at UCLA are going to be living in very similar structures. And so one of the things I'm interested in is all of their markers of their class-based identity are removed. There's a poem a Yiddish poem written in Los Angeles in 1925, where it starts, Los Angeles. And it's like, gone are the Pittsburgh smokestacks, the downtown hovels, the narrow streets of Boston. Like, instead, we built lovely cottages with just cut green lawns and towering palms. The people are worn out. They close their doors and windows at night. So it's about the kind of loss of community that this kind of suburban landscape. I've read some of these poems at events before, and I am inevitably asked if they are about gentrification, right? Because it's kind of about what happens when your community that is used to living in closely packed, densely crowded neighborhoods, where to a certain extent, Jewishness was kind of ambient. The sights and sounds of Jewish communal life were kind of ambient. All of a sudden, you're plopped into beautiful Los Angeles with your lawn and your little cottage and your orange tree in the back, and how that informed their class consciousness is what I'm really, really interested in. Spoiler alert, it strains their class consciousness to a certain extent. And a lot of that has to do with race in the mode that I was describing before, right? You know, do we actually have anything in common with that Mexican track layer who lives down the street? Was an open question, and one they considered a lot. Are we, in fact, part of the proletariat or not? I mean, that was a debate that is riven through the communities I write about well into the 1940s. Who are the real proletarians?
Mm-hmm.
Are we proletarian? I own my home. I own a car. Do I count as part of the proletariat or not?
Mm-hmm.
Is the question I'm interested in.
Yeah, that was all super interesting. And I feel like it's really important for laying out the broader context in which Jews were relating to capital and to labor and to land and to political systems of colonization. And you mentioned you focus really on that second generation of Jews moving to Los Angeles who weren't so wrapped up in those capitalist colonial institutions. What were those Jews' relationship to labor? What drove them west, and how did they see themselves in relation to other laborers within the Los Angeles context?
Yeah, I mean that's really the bulk of what the book is about. I'll say a couple things in response to that. One, I wouldn't completely let them off the hook, in that for many of them, the West became, as I say, a kind of virgin land to live out utopian possibilities. So a few years back, my colleague Erin Fagan, who's now at University of Wisconsin, we were talking about this story that I thought was an allegory, written by a Yiddish writer here. It's about Baruch. And the story of Baruch is that he lives in this like colony with all these New York intellectuals, and he's the only one who knows how to do anything. He has to teach him how to farm. He has to teach him how to build houses. He has to teach him how to chop wood, all this stuff. And then one day Baruch goes out into the woods in search of timber and never comes back, and the whole colony collapses. I thought that was an allegory about, frankly, like Zionism or something. I don't know. I was like, this is interesting. And she's like, oh, no, that's a real story. And so there were various, I mentioned the Industrial Removal Office, but this case was called the Clarion Colony. It was in Utah. It was not that they didn't know how to do anything, although they didn't. It was mostly that they had gotten sold a patch of land without any water. And, the state of Utah kept promising them, no, the water's coming, but they never got their water. And so the colony collapsed. But there were these ventures. And my colleague Maxwell, who I mentioned before, has written about some of them in Mexico as well, where joint stock formation that Herzl proposes in his Judenstaat book was very much practiced in the American West. There was a thought that you could return to the land and build your beautiful utopian colony because, the West was an empty land in need of improvement, kind of thing. So there's a degree to which that kind of optimism in the regenerative possibilities of the West actually is profoundly important to their success. Like, they believed it, and so they did it. And in some ways, I don't think that's a bad thing that, a bunch of 21, 22-year-old immigrants decided, hey, man, let's start a mutual aid society so that we can, provide healthcare to one another and that we don't die of tuberculosis. That's cool. That's great. That's wonderful. At the same time, I do think that the tension between the universal in particular that I mentioned before is certainly a theme in every sort of history of the American Jewish labor movement, which is to say, On the one hand, these are folks who embraced socialists, communists, anarchists, embraced very much a universal working class identity. They committed themselves to bringing their fellow Jews into that space and to cultivating an identity as part of an international working class that needed to fight together to overthrow capitalism and replace it with something different. On the other hand, many of them born of their own experiences in Eastern Europe, born of their experiences in the United States as well, embraced some form of Jewish nationalism. And that really, really did range. I mean, I do write about communist Zionists. I write about regular good old-fashioned Zionists. I write about socialist Zionists. On the other end of things were more diasporic forms of nationalism, but the choice to use Yiddish, because as I mentioned before, for most of these folks, it was a choice. On the one hand, it was a practical necessity for reaching at least their imagination of the average Jewish worker. But for most of them, they are making an ideological commitment to cultivating Yiddish culture as a font of a new secular transnational Jewish identity that could bind Jews together throughout the world and maintain collectivity and common purpose in spite of these multitudes and ranges of observance and belief and politics. So, Yiddish in that way, cultivating Yiddish was a nationalist project. There's just like no two ways around it. Diasporic nationalism, maybe, but nationalism nonetheless. And so that tension between the universal and particular is sort of an individual struggle for each of them, and then a kind of organizational and or political struggle in terms of how they did their organizing, who they reached in their organizing, and how they navigated the particular ethno-racial landscape of their industries in LA. And just as an example, Gabe, I know Philly had a huge garment workers movement. I've been writing about the struggles in the garment unions in the 1910s and 20s, these political factions. Philly, like LA, was one of the cities where the rank and file of the ILG basically said, we got to stop using Yiddish. We got to be organizing our non-Jewish peers. We got to embrace industrial modes of organizing, drop these skilled versus unskilled, integrate women, be much more inclusive. They wanted the shop committee structure. They are kicked out of the ILGW for that. I don't know if you know that story. I'm assuming you do. But, in Los Angeles, that I think the starkness of the failures of that model were made even more clear because something, like 75% of the industry was of Mexican descent. And so to do Yiddish, okay, you're going to get the skilled custom tailors, maybe the pressers, maybe the cutters, the highest skilled. That David Dubinsky was a cutter. So, the highest skilled, most craftsman oriented guys. But guess what? People don't wear a lot of cloaks in Los Angeles. You don't wear a lot of furs. Most people are wearing dresses and sportswear. And in that sector of the industry, it was almost entirely women workers and particularly women of Mexican descent. So these debates between the universal in particular, on the one hand, were very hypothetical and very political and very much about alignments and global politics. But on the one hand, were much more like pragmatic and practical and born of material realities on the ground. I'll leave it at that. I think that's answers your question.
That's perfect.
No
There was one story I found in Philly of, I think it was an anarchist meeting. Everyone was giving speeches. A English-speaking, German-speaking, Yiddish-speaking, and Italian-speaking crowd.
Love it.
And after each speech, one person would come up, give a speech in one of the four languages. Another person would come up and give a translation of that same speech. And they would just go down the line, and probably took 4 times as long to get through the meeting. But
I was gonna say it must have been the most annoying meeting on the ground, but I love that. What you were saying just popped into my head. There's an organization called Kiwa here in Los Angeles, Korean Immigrant Workers Alliance, that was founded in the late 80s, early 90s to really organize Korean American workers, Korean immigrant workers in a neighborhood known as Koreatown here in Los Angeles. But as we know, neighborhoods are often, the names are kind of lagging behind the demographic realities of those neighborhoods. So Koreatown today is a majority Latinx neighborhood. And Kiwa started realizing that they're organizing workers in like Korean-owned grocery stores, but those workers are not Korean speaking. So they do their meetings, per your point about multiple languages, they do trilingual English, Spanish, Korean meetings, which means, yes, sometimes they do take longer, but it's an important sign of international solidarity, right? If that's the workforce that you're organizing, that's what you got to do. And I think it matters a lot to people to have that sort of signifier of inclusivity, even if it means it's a little bit clunky. There's always that one guy who's going to give like a 30-minute speech too.
They did also note that like each section of the crowd would cheer independently. But to kind of tie this in, and especially with like the internal conflicts in the ILG, there's one thing that I've always been interested in, and I think we're starting to see another example kind of raise up, is the conflict between rank and file pressure and institutionalism within organized labor. And I don't have any hard evidence presently, but at least from the anecdotes from people I've spoken to, if you're a left-wing Jew in the modern labor movement, you're probably part of a pro-Palestine rank and file caucus. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kind of tendency of rank and file radicalism within Jewish labor, and possibly how we're seeing some reflections of that today. Obviously, we don't have majority Jewish unions anymore, but I think there's still something going on there.
I love that question, Gabe, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it totally adequately, but maybe I'll try to just say what popped into my head as you were saying that, and then maybe we can discuss, because Jordan, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well. I will say that understanding these conflicts is a mess, I will tell you. I mean, I remember when I was first reading the CPUSA reels in 1999, the now non-Soviet government finally released records from the American Communist Party, and I was going through them, and they were fighting all the time. And I was like, what the hell is going on? I was Googling, I mean, this terminology, and it's all so inside baseball, who's he what's, third plenum on what's he who. I was trying to figure it out, and I was like, what is going on? And then I was like, wait, Globerman, hold on. And then I went to page back, Globerman, and then I page back through my, oh my God, Globerman's just an asshole. Like, it was just this like, aha, like, this has nothing to do with anything. This guy is just a pain in the ass to work with, right? So I say that because I think it's really important as historians that we be generous with the people we're writing about, because we don't know if Globerman's an asshole, if that makes sense. Like, there's only so much we can learn about some of these characters, particularly from the unruly rank and file. But I would say I try to bring the same lens to the institutionalists as well. I mean, maybe not David Dubinsky. I've decided I do not like David Dubinsky, but just to say, like, in LA, at least, you know, when those conflicts, I remember there's this guy, Julius Levitt, he's one of the characters in my book. He was a Bundist in Vilna, ends up in Newark, New Jersey for a while, where he starts the first chapter of the Arbiter Ring there, comes to LA and is the managing editor of the Forwards for years, and kind of plays a role in doing a lot of stuff. I mean, he's distributing the Forwards. He's kind of around. He's sort of one of those legend guys. And in his writing about the conflicts of the 1930s, he described, or 1920s rather, he described it as, you know, everybody showed up and thought they had a real macher in them. Like, everybody thought they were an important person that everybody else had to listen to, right? And as someone who organizes in higher ed, where there's turnover in the workforce all the time, that phenomenon is very real, of like, a new crowd shows up. Maybe they have ideological affinities elsewhere. Maybe they bring with them a vision of how good organizing works and what it looks like based on previous experience. I mean, I always say of my higher ed colleagues, people bring like real praxis. Like, they're not kidding. They have thought a lot about it. They have practiced it. They have like really, really well-developed ideas about what they're up to. And they're going to bring those into the organization, and it's really hard to make space. I try to bring sympathy to the institutionalists because, like, when Julius Levitt is complaining, like he's complaining about a real phenomenon. He's complaining about like Johnny on the block showing up and being like, you're doing everything wrong. Listen to me. I know what's up, right? At the same time, I don't in any ways want to become an apologist for some of the atrocious behavior of those institutionalists during these conflicts. I mean, that's why I mentioned Dubinsky. Dubinsky behaved like a monster. You read the records of these meetings and it's really disgusting, despicable behavior. His treatment of Sasha Zimmerman, who I'm just like obsessed with, it's awful. It's atrocious, right? And very Manichaean. He's doing all this stuff behind closed doors and, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we try to have historical empathy. My college mentor really taught me about historical empathy, particularly in talking about religious people. I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in God. So studying religious people means I have to like really open my mind to the idea that these people believe what they believe very sincerely, and you have to meet them at that place. You cannot assume ill intention or bad faith motives, while also recognizing failures in leadership and pitfalls. And I think too often this takes the form of institutional memory. So I have seen people use rules, use institutional structures that they know because they've been around for a while to put people down. And I'm not going to give a specific example there because I would probably get myself into trouble, but to like kind of exploit people's newness against them, to shove them out. Or to say, that's not how we do things. No, we can't do that. I mean, the can't, I think, is a word all of us who believe ourselves to be leaders in our unions need to just like strip from our mouths. Telling a new member, a rank and file member, a newly activated member that they can't do something is just infinitely damaging to solidarity and unity in those moments, right? We can't do that. That's not possible. That's not how it works, right? Even when sometimes that's not how it works. So, in my own union, which is run by Randy Weingarten, who has been a very open, progressive kind of, I would call her a PEP for sure, a two-state solution type for years and years and years. I mean, on the one hand, we've been able to move her, which I think is actually a testament to her leadership, which hasn't moved super far, but she's moved, and that's really great. But it's taken a lot of the rank and file to, as the communists would have said, use the tools of the oppressor against them, right? To like understand how the rules work, to educate ourselves in terms of how like resolution procedures work and what we can do as locals and what we can't. And how we can move things kind of up the chain. I would say that the absolute like monster behavior from our universities has helped with that. When your university is firing, rounds at your colleagues and arresting people, it becomes a lot easier to persuade your union that they need to step up and defend their members. But just to say that there are AFT, like the ILG, has a legacy of a very robust Jewish membership that signed on to a vision of what role unions should. I mean, we invested in Israeli bonds. We finally got that. That was a national movement to get that out of our investments. Longtime donators to Histadrut, which is the Israeli labor coalition. Stuff like that is around in a lot more unions than people realize. And it's going to take longer work to kind of strip some of that infrastructure out if we want our unions to move in the right direction. God, that didn't answer your question at all. But Jordan, what do you think about that? Because you've been bouncing up against a lot more of these limits, I think, than I have. If only because my union has been so inflexible that way.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't in the union for very long, but I was in UAW 4811, which is the UC Student Workers Union or Academic Workers Union that was on strike this past spring. That was an unfair labor practice strike. And, reading the unfair labor practices that the UAW filed, they're very legitimate. But at the other side, it was viewed by many as a political strike, and that's not allowed, Taft-Hartley and whatnot. And as someone who was new to the union at the time, I was very much trying to walk this line between like showing up for my fellow workers, my students. One of my students was arrested the UC invited tons of cops, or not cops, they were, people called them mall cops. They were security thugs from a corporation that were there to help maintain order, I guess, though they made people a lot more uncomfortable than campus had been before. And I was in this strike. This is how me and Caroline met. I invited her as a collaborator for a teach-in that was kind of trying to invite and honor the Jewish place within these labor organizing efforts. And I had friends that were in the rank and file caucus. I tried to kind of be in between rank and file and the union leadership. I didn't want to be partisan, and there were a lot of people in the rank and file caucus who were very against the kind of strong-handed decision making that the union leadership was making. And there were people in the union leadership that were trying to invite them in, but there was just so much disagreement, especially because the rank and file caucus was like, this is a strike for Palestine. And if the union leadership said that, we would probably, there would have been an injunction, things would have ended poorly. And things did end poorly. The UC on that side ended up finding a right-wing judge to deliver an injunction. They went around the California Labor Relations Board to find a judge that would do this for them, just because finals were coming up and they're like, we got to do this. And it was a mess. And meeting fellow Jewish people, meeting fellow union members and leadership in that strike really galvanized me, thinking that the union isn't about the leadership. It's about the people, the workers who really do have the power to bring about change. But there's just so much power that the university wields that it's very hard to, show up and have a union strike also stand for divestment. And I know that's something that AFT also has tried to reconcile, because, divestment is the primary tool that the university can use to leverage their financial power to bring about positive change. And on that same note, like, different theories of change is a big point of where there was that contention between rank and file members and union leadership, because union leadership thinks one way about how can we bring about change, and the rank and file largely is like, it's all about disruption, disrupt, because that's the way that we can actually convince the people who just care about money, which, more and more are universities or corporations that just care about, revenue. And so it's a really hard thing to navigate. And, I tried to show up as a member of the union, as, a teacher who was caring about my students. And, I got served a warning from the university saying, you weren't allowed to do this, but, things don't work that way. And, the students recognize that the university, in their brazen support of the violence that went down at UCLA, people felt like this was a time we needed to stand up and speak out. And, that's what a lot of people in the union did. And that just shows up in different ways. We kind of have been dancing around this institutional factor that labor organizing is like deeply entrenched in. You mentioned the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. But one thing that came up when we were talking about this before was the 20,000 strike. And why did that strike work the way it did? And what was different about that strike? Is there anything we can learn about labor organizing from this particular historical strike?
Yeah, I love that your brain went there, Jordan, because that actually was one thing that was coming into my mind as you were saying that. So I'm going to get to that in just a second, but just to say, part of the other operating dynamic when it comes to sort of institutionalist leadership that we experienced was that, that question of sort of wisdom, knowledge, experience, what's likely to happen, right? And that's kind of what I mean in terms of how institutional memory can be wielded as a weapon at times, right? And yet institutional memory is also vital because they understand the legalities of things and the guardrails that you have to look out for. So it's really, really hard. And when you're in the heat of the moment, that decision-making processes all break down. Everybody's being asked to do, when we almost took our members out on strike, like, we didn't have time to run everything through the membership, and we're a tiny union compared to you guys. So just to say, trying to give grace. And I think what you just described is really the sweet spot. It's the magic of everything. How can we not trap ourselves? But what I would say is in my impression, and this is part of my praxis, you have to believe in the capacity of your members. You have to believe that they know what they're doing. You have to believe that your fellow workers are smart, capable, wonderful people who know what they're doing, and you have to trust that. And I say that as a segue to the uprising of the 20,000, because basically the ILG, and this was true of a lot of craft unions, this is just one example, it emerges amongst highly skilled custom tailors. One thing to keep in mind is like people didn't buy their clothes at a store in the 19th century, really. Ready-made clothing, the kind of like you walk into a store and there's 5 suits on a rack and you pick one that's your size, doesn't really emerge until the late 19th century. So custom tailors are the kind of guys that would make you a custom suit. And that was mostly what was being sold, is a suit that was designed to you. You'd buy one maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. And that would be what you wore like every day. Just imagine how bad people smelled. That's all I can say about that. So in the late 19th century, you finally get ready-made clothing really emerging on a mass scale. The biggest producers of that are department stores. A lot of those department stores are owned by Jews. Brooks Brothers is a seminal company. I always love to talk about the Brooks Brothers because they get into the business of making suits during the Civil War. That's one time you need to mass produce suits, right? Is uniforms. So they start in uniforms, then they start mass producing pre-sized suits. I don't know what the size is. I don't know enough to tell you about how that worked, but just to say, you start to get the first like factories. Of course, with factory work comes the de-skilling of labor. So you start to have mass adoption of sewing machines. All of a sudden, these custom tailors who are doing everything by hand, who have very, very high skills, cutters, pressers, custom tailors, furriers, cloak makers, as I say, are starting to feel the pressure of their bosses trying to displace their labor. And so they start to organize in the late 19th century. These are almost entirely men. And from the jump, they are excluding anyone that they deemed unskilled, because the model of a craft union is that if you get all workers in a given trade, all the plumbers, all the carpenters, all the bakers, in my case, to refuse to work below a certain wage, then you can essentially control your craft, right? And by doing so, you're taking wages out of competition. So you're incentivizing employers to work with your union because then they can compete on reputation and not on labor costs, right? So that's the goal. Take wages out of competition. And you do it through craft discipline. Often they have elaborate apprenticeship structures. The building trades still have this, which controls admittance to your craft, which is to say, you know, you had to know how to make a bagel, right? Someone had to teach you. If you limit the number of people that can learn, then you can limit how many bagel bakers there are in the city. You do it through varieties of internal discipline. Often they would serve as hiring halls. So if you wanted to hire a bagel baker, instead of posting an ad, I need a bagel baker, you go to the union hall, you say, I need 2 guys to help me make a big order, and they send it over. And that's really how custom tailoring worked. These shops would expand and contract alongside the union, but the mass adoption of the sewing machine totally undercuts that, because to bring your own sewing machines. When you think of like the Lower East Side, just imagine a bunch of guys, you can see this in some photos, carrying around their own box sewing machine, just, you know, running around town. So with de-skilling, you get more and more women entering the industry. And this was true of baking as well. Now, bakers were not the only people baking. Come on, bros. We know that. Women are baking in the home, right? Women are sewing in the home. So this whole conceit that they were the only people, only us skilled master bakers are the ones baking is completely ridiculous, because women are doing it at home. With the mass adoption of sewing machines, many of those women are starting to pick up work. They're starting to come into the factory, join the workforce. There's varieties of informal relationships as well, what we call industrial homework, but I'll set that aside. But these men are just frustrated about it. They're pissed about that. They don't believe these women have the capacity to organize. Some of them called them pin girls, which is to say they're not working for their careers or to support their families. They're just working for pin money to buy little like baubles for their hair or buy a fancy hat. As will not surprise you, many of these women garment workers were very well dressed because they made their own clothes, because they were skilled seamstresses. So they made their own outfits. Every article about the uprising of the 20,000 includes some mention of how well-dressed and glamorous all the women are. The same was true of every strike in LA. They're like, oh my gosh, and they all have these great hats and whatever. So 2 of those women, Rose Schneiderman, who came into the ILG in 1903, she was a cap maker, immigrated with her family when she was a little kid, and then her father died. So I think it was when she was 12, she first went into the shop. This is a tiny little woman, red hair. She's like 4'10". She is where we get the term bread and roses from. She says that off the cuff in a speech during the Lawrence textile strike. Amazing. She's amazing. I'm in love with her. So she starts organizing some of these women. One of the women she recruits is a woman named Pauline Newman. Pauline Newman had helped with a tenant strike on the Lower East Side in 1907, had some organizing experience. She was a shirtwaist maker. Shirtwaists are just blouses, custom clothes, these new styles. So they start organizing women workers, and then they get together with Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, they don't really get together. They talk to them about doing what they called International Working Women's Day. February 1909 is the first, we now call it International Women's Day. It has been completely corporatized and bastardized. It is International Working Women's Day. And the first time they observed it was in 1909. And it was an experiment. It was what we'd call in the parlance of modern unions, a structure test. They held this parade and they said, how many people are going to show up to this parade? How many of these women are going to come out and show up to this parade? And guess what? A whole bunch of them did. They were like, yay, I'm a working woman. It became evidence that they had embraced an identity as workers, that they didn't just think of themselves as pin girls. So they do that in February. And they're like, all right, I think we got to mobilize a strike. They start forming shop committees. They start getting everyone together. I think it's December. They decide to do a one-day walkout, and they're going to gather at Cooper Union afterwards to have a meeting. People who would gather at that meeting are mostly men. It's like the head of the United Hebrew Trades. I think Meyer London is there, who's then the head of the Socialist Party in New York, or the Socialist Party on the Lower East Side. All these bros, and they're all talking. And a young woman named Clara Lemlich, who was 17 years old at the time, interrupts them, I gather, and basically is like, enough talking. Are we going to strike or not? Let's take the oath. I'm going to strike. All the women in the room are like, hell yeah, we're striking. She starts, I forget the exact words, but it's something like, I am one of those striking women. I've had enough of your speeches. Are we going to do this or not? They stay out for, I think it's 3 months, maybe 4 months through the winter. That's a very, very long strike, and they win. The reason it's called an uprising is in part because the cloak makers, all those high-skilled tailors, decide they are going to go on strike the following year. They call that strike the Great Revolt, whereas the women's strike is called the Uprising of 1909. So in my class, I talk a lot about the gendered binary that is built into those two names. They view this action by this woman as kind of an inchoate, spontaneous uprising and not an organized strike campaign. That's why I always start with International Working Women's Day. So you can see it as a longer organizing campaign that had structure and purpose and strategy, and not just a spontaneous uprising. But in the ILG's own narrative, the cloak makers are the ones that actually do a strike. That's a revolt. The uprising is just, this spontaneous mass of women being crazy, that kind of thing. But they win. And I think it's something like 270 of 300 shirtwaist shops are organized. One of the holdouts is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And so in my class, we always follow the great victory of 1909 with the great tragedy of 1911 and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory following.
I do very briefly just want to interject and add the uprising of the 20,000 and the Girl Army in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's right.
And as a Philadelphia nationalist, I have to throw that in.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, I think that's great. And the garment workers in LA go out for the first time during the 1910 cloakmakers strike. So I feel you. We need to amend these narratives, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pivot more towards what I call recent history, or post World War II era. We no longer see Jewish majority unions, and in a way, a lot of Jewish identity has been decoupled from proletarian or working class identity. How has Jewish labor consciousness or Jewish identity shifted through this transition? And where are we now?
Yeah, that's a big question. All right, I'll try to do this as briefly as I can. I would say there's kind of 3 big things that happen in the post-war era, and this is not ranking them in any kind of order, just to say, the first of those is upward mobility. That process starts before the war. It really starts with the new labor protections of the New Deal and the kind of job stability and wage security those afforded. I always think about this in terms of UCLA because a lot of the younger communists I write about came to UCLA in the 1930s, and they're able to do that basically because their fathers had more stable employment. They could like count on it. So they're like, yeah, you can go to college, we can take that risk, or we can buy a house, or we can move a little further away. That's what job security affords. And the labor protections of the New Deal allowed unions to win and win big contracts, sometimes with pensions. I mean, eventually with like pensions and healthcare and all that kind of stuff. So that process of upward mobility is often presented intergenerationally. The big bit of legislation there is the GI Bill. Something like 500,000 Jewish Americans serve in the Second World War. All of them, thanks to the GI Bill, are giving access to very low interest loans to start a business, go to college, and buy a house, or one of the three. I don't know if you could do all three. I don't know of any cases of anyone doing all three, but my friend's grandfather got a GI Bill to start his haberdasher shop. A lot of generational upward mobility is often facilitated by war service. And this factors in the westward migration as well. So LA's Jewish population triples in size in the wake of World War II because a lot of GIs came here. They were like, yo, this is so nice. I'm not moving back to Cleveland after the war. We're moving to LA. And the Jewish population goes from something like 100,000 to 650,000 by 1960. It just explodes. And it explodes in the Valley specifically. So you've got upward mobility, leaving, things like the garment trade. A lot of people worked out their careers, but they would retire, or maybe they'd start a garment shop. So maybe it's like your dad made pants, you started in a pants shop, you came back from World War II, you made your own pants business rather than going back to line work. The second major thing in terms of unions is anti-communism. So there is I don't think I need to go into the details of the purge that happens in the post-war era, but there's Taft-Hartley creates loyalty oaths. So all unions are purged. Even before HUAC begins its trials, the CIO does a huge purge.
The HUAC is the House Un-American Activities Commission, which was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy.
And when we say purge, I mean blacklisting activists, making it impossible for them to get their jobs, kicking entire unions out of the CIO. And often there were fellow travelers, you might say, who also was like, I'm not going to sign a loyalty oath. They just turned off from the labor movement broadly as a place to do their radical politics, and often looking for other spaces and other things to do. The final piece is Israel and the state of Israel, and the way that collapses some of this political energy, some of this nationalist impulse into a much more consolidated bloc. I mentioned this before, but the spectrum of Jewish nationalism needs to be remembered. I think it would behoove all of us to really remind ourselves what a wide variety of nationalisms there were. There were so many different parties and so many different party lines and so many different ways of thinking about what it meant to be a Jew, all of which were premised on the idea that Jewish peoplehood was something worth preserving, that it was worth preserving some kind of Jewish collective identity. In the wake of the Shoah and the creation of the state of Israel, that entire impulse really collapses into the state of Israel. Even among some of the hardcore left people that I write about and study, we talk a lot about historical contingency. It felt to them at that time that was it. There was no other way. All those other possibilities had been foreclosed on, and this was going to be the only way. I'm delighted to see that space opening back up, but it cannot be overstated how the political imaginations of the Jewish left were imprinted, I guess, by the 1-2 punch of the Shoah and the creation of the state of Israel, not just the creation of the state of Israel. But you can see that imprint in these unions that had Jewish majorities today, as I mentioned before, right? What does a teachers' union have to do with Israel? Well, it has to do with Jewish members of that union going to their national conventions and passing resolutions, pledging their support to the Histadrut, or, using resolutions to get them to invest in Israeli bonds or give money to the Jewish National Fund or whatever it may be. So I think those three kind of pillars just tend to sort of shift the political imagination and political organizing within the Jewish community in a much more liberal direction. I would not say conservative. I'd say classic liberal, capital D, democratic fashion. And that is still remains the case. I know we feel this real right-wing pull. I've just been reading Jewish Current's new issue on Florida, and God help us all that Florida is not the future of Jewish community life. But here in Los Angeles, even in the most kind of conservative parts of town where the voter turnout for that orange monster was the highest, it's still a very significant Democratic, at least registered Democratic majority, 75%. So that kind of consensus is, I guess, what I would say, Jordan. It went from being this very noisy, very broad spectrum, lots of rivalries, lots of antagonisms. I see that as a dynamic tension to me. People wistfully will talk about Boyle Heights having this, you could hear Yiddish on the street corner. And I always tell them, I'm like, yeah, it was a communist and a socialist arguing with each other on the street corner. It wasn't some guy like spouting off poetry. It was either what we see in immigrant communities today, where it's some weird street preacher who's like, screaming about the devil, or it was probably two political people arguing with each other, right? So to me, the conflict is actually generative. I think it was amazing. I think it was this engine for coalition building, and it's good for all of us to practice building things with people we don't agree with 100%. That is one thing I do think is dangerous about our political landscape today, is there's a degree of siloing that I think social media affords. I think our like modes of communication afford, where we really get ourselves, and I don't just mean like your algorithm. I mean like you literally have cut those people out of your life and you never talk to them again. And that means you never have to try to navigate a conversation with someone you disagree with, right? That's a very important organizing skill, to be able to talk to someone and move someone to take action, even though you're not fully aligned on everything, is a very important political challenge for all of us. But yeah, all that to say, this noisy, loud, conflict-ridden, vibrantly diversified Jewish community life really collapses in the post-war era into a consensus that was, again, default liberal or progressive, I'm doing air quotes for the listeners, but was static and dangerously narrowed. And I think so many of my Jewish friends have come up in those communities where there just wasn't really another option presented to them. There's a little bit of smugness about their more observant, fellow Jews, right? Oh, not those from people, that's not us. But that was the only real alternative that they saw. Either this is very California specific, but either you're like Reform, maybe conservative, synagogue, or you're latently supportive of Israel. You might go on birthright. Maybe you go to a Jewish camp. Your family votes Democratic. That was what they were offered. And then the only alternative to that they could conceive of at the time, and I don't mean to generalize here, but I think I'm hitting on something relevant. The only alternative was, or you can go be from, right? Or you can go, there's a Chabad center down the street from my friend's house, and I make jokes all the time about one of her sons joining the Chabad center, and she looks horrified. And I'm like, no, that would be funny. I would love it. Like, why not? Like, in traditional Jewish families in Eastern Europe, it was always that way. It was like one brother was a socialist and the other one was super duper observant and went to conservative yeshiva. Like, what's the problem? So I think part of what needs to change is maybe we need to get a little bit more comfortable with the discordant and the conflicts, and not fool ourselves to think that this is ever going to be a majority position, or that we want to seize that majority, because maybe that 70% block is actually a problem. Maybe it's a problem to have that liberal consensus. Again, I say this as a Californian, where like our political landscape is locked. We're trapped in a liberal consensus that we can't get ourselves out of, and doesn't actually feel productive anymore. And now it's running for president. So there you go. Sorry, I don't mean the liberal consensus of California is running for president as well.
Yeah. A good friend who has some fantastic stories about her, I think, great grandfather, who into like her lifetime did not speak to his brother over disagreements about the Soviet purges of Jews in the 30s. And his brother was hardline CPUSA to the core. They were, of course, both ILG members their entire lives. But yeah, to their dying day, they would not speak to each other because of that specific disagreement.
I love that so much. I love it. That's great. That's really, really great. I mean, it's great. It probably was awful.
Yeah.
I love that story. Thank you for sharing that, Gabe.
Mm-hmm. And so that kind of brings up to the present with anti-communism, upward mobility, the formation of that Zionist consensus, and the synagogues that kind of emerge out of that. Where I grew up in a synagogue that had an American flag on one side and an Israeli flag on another. And we would kind of get told the one-sided narrative of Israeli state formation. And, then coming up in this world where we're increasingly seeing anti-Palestinian violence, and so many Jews are struggling with this. And so as we're moving into the space where we're no longer just students, we're workers, we're forced with this dilemma of like, where's my loyalty lie? And where do my values direct me? And to kind of, why does my Jewishness have to define my politics? And should I be focused more on, Tikkun Olam or Israel? And there's that conflict that the liberal Zionist institutions just don't resolve for us. They leave us kind of open, and so many Jews are now struggling with that.
To further complicate everything and add even more layers of possible Jewish identity, to add to Tikkun Olam, I would say to include Chavashaft as another third option, to have the secular, purely proletarian aspect to it, which I think secular Jewish communism and socialism has been a very interesting thing to both see start to come back a little bit, but had been pretty much wiped out except for small enclaves in New York for most of the second half of the 20th century.
And Haverschaft, I've seen it translated solidarity, comradeship, friendship, socialism.
Yeah.
I would just say to everyone who's listening out there, to me, the first question is, what do you want? What can the world look like for all of us? You have to kind of imagine something before you're ever gonna get there. Gaza is a prism, right? It allows us to see all these overlapping layers of crisis and conjuncture that are all like happening and feel so locked, and we feel so trapped. I think we have to start imagining what that other thing could look like in the most aspirational, utopian kind of way. To get back to my guys, these guys were just imagining. I imagine them sitting there in the Volozhin yeshiva, staring out the window. This is actually quite literally what one of the famous Yiddish poets talks about doing. He's talked about looking out the window and staring at a goat. That's how he became a communist. Because he was so bored in yeshiva, just like daydreaming, thinking about what he wanted the world to look like. And there's no reason why we can't do that as a starting stone for where we go from here. Is where do we want to go? What do we want to win? What do we want to see?
We've really seen how that utopian horizon of the journey west, of manifest destiny, or in the Jewish sense of just striving towards a better world, recognizing that future lies in our hands. And, that mutated within all these different violent contexts of colonialism, of Zionism, but the drive forward towards a utopian horizon where, I guess to use the word of the Zapatistas, a world where many worlds fit, is so important. And I think that continues to drive forward the labor organizers and unions everywhere. And I just hope we can get there within our lifetime, or at least before, the climate wipes out not all life on Earth, but we got a timeline. With that, let's leave with a utopian thought on our mind, not that dystopian one. And let's hope that one step at a time, we'll get there.
Thank you guys so much for having me. This was a really lovely and generative conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks so much for being here, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe.
Und a Schwur von Tränen, mir schweren, Freiheit und Grenzen zum Bund. Nur erkennbar freien die Sklaven sind, die von die Reute ist hoch und breit. Sie flattert von Zorn, von Blut ist sie reut. A Schwur, auf Leben und Tod. Himmel und Ergewöhnung, so ist Herren, ey, das wird sein, die lichtige Sterne. A Schwur von Blut und a Schwur von Tränen, wir schweren, wir schweren, wir schweren. Und a Schwur von Tränen, wir schweren, wir schweren, wir schweren.